Hello, my name is Sabne Raznik. You have found the channel here on YouTube where I do what I call mini readings. Usually just one poem. Sometimes it's my own work if I've got something new out or I'm promoting something. Sometimes it's a poetry reading that I have participated in digitally. And I get permission to upload those, or maybe it's a poetry reading I have hosted. That happens too. And then I upload those. Sometimes it's somebody else's because I just like to share the poésie joie. And my goal with sharing other people's work is that I'm trying to get a library here that will be kind of like an introduction to world poetry. Really difficult to do though because world poetry is such a huge spectrum, but that's why I call it an introduction to world poetry, right? And so this channel has been here since 2011, and there have been breaks in my filming, of course, because sometimes I move and I'll not be able to fully unpack for several years, and I won't have the equipment to film. Just because life is, as John Lennon famously said, is what happens while you're busy making other plans, and sometimes things get chaotic. And then my health, I'm a disabled person, so that means that my health never gets better. In fact, over time it's getting worse, not because the disability itself is getting worse, but because of the complications of living with that disability as I get older. Like, everybody's health gets worse as they get older, but when you're born disabled and then you get older, the way you get older is different than it is for able-bodied people. And it's quite, I understand getting older for able-bodied people is quite harrowing as well. It's not a pleasant experience for anybody. As as my grandparents used to say, growing old is not for the faint of heart. But when you're already born disabled, so you already have all these extra issues from the get-go, growing older is a whole other level of something that should have been included maybe in Dante's depiction of hell. I don't know. But anyway, so that also has affected how this channel has gotten run over the years, because that's affected my ability to run the channel properly, and I have only just figured out how to make that work in any real sense. This year I decided in the beginning of the year, or maybe that was last year, anyway, time, especially since COVID, time has become a very ambiguous subject for me. Sometimes I'm not sure what week I'm in, let alone what day. Anyway, so it could have happened like probably last year, actually. Anyway, I'd made this decision to try to upload more on a schedule. Try with once a month, right? And it's easy goal to hit once a month. And in order to do that, I decided film in blocks and make it easier. Film more than, like when I sit down to film more than one video, and that's why a lot of times you'll see videos where I'm wearing the same thing video after video. It's not, it's because I've filmed all those on the same day and then I upload them over time, right? And that way I can keep things on the schedule once a month. So far that has worked, yay! So, and then other times whenever I find that I happen to have makeup on or something, I will film a little video too, if I have the energy and all that. So today I just so happen to have makeup on too, and I know my hair is wild and it's wet, and I just when I wash my hair I just let it air dry, because it just seems to be better. If I blow dry it, it does this thing And if I let it air dry, then it does its natural wavy curly thing, at least for that one day. Yeah, and then the first time I brush it, then all that prettiness is gone. But anyway, so that's what we're doing now. We're letting it air dry, and then so I can be pretty for what I put makeup on. And I thought, well, while we're doing that, let's make a video. Yeah. So today I thought we're gonna make a video about a poet from a place, a poem. We're gonna read a poem by a poet from a place that, as far as I know, we have not featured on this channel before. This is a poet from Croatia, and Croatia is one of those hot spots in the world that occasionally breaks out in war. You know, famously Serbia, Croatia, Sarajevo, that whole area is Yugoslavia, is just famously hot, and it's how World War I started. Was that whole area blew up, right? And it just occasionally does, and it's really sad that that happens, because it's also a famously diverse area in terms of the ethnicities that live there and the religions. It's just it's really a beautiful place when you think about the diversity of the peoples that live in that area of Europe. And so I thought, well, let's read a poem from Croatia. This is a relatively young poet from Croatia. This is Monika Herceg, and we're going to read one of her poems. She actually lived through the war during the 90s, I think, if I understood her bio correctly. It says, I can only see a piece of it on the particular page that I'm on. It says that she spent her childhood in a small village near Sisak, where her earliest memories were formed in the shadow of the War of Yugoslavia. So, now I'm not 100% sure that I'm pronouncing any of these names correctly, including hers. I am not fluent in any of those languages or anything, but that's why when I read poems from these other places, I read the poems in English. And if, you know, whatever the original language is, I read their English translations. If you happen to find that you are familiar with the original language, I encourage you to go back and read the poem in its original language. You can read the poem in its original language and its English translation right next to each other. That's always fun, because they're usually similar, but also two different animals, because poetry in translation is like its own art form, right? And just the way language works in translation, and also the way poetry works, it's difficult to translate poetry. You can't really do it literally, right? So then you end up with these two different works of art out of the same poem. And if you are able to compare them, that's always fun. So I encourage people to do that. My dog, that was my dog. She saw something outside and got excited on the window. Hopefully she won't do that again, because I don't want to have to call at her on film. Anyway, this is a poem called Same Old Stories, and I got it from one of my favorite sites to use as a resource for this kind of thing. Is poetryinternational.com. Originally it was called Poetry International Web. I found it in like 2004 whenever I first got a internet enabled computer. So it's been around forever, this resource. It has poems from poets from all over the world. It's kind of like a version of what I'm trying to do here, except they don't have audio files, right? You just have to read the poems. And I remember when I first found it, although they do have like the English translation and the original language poems right next to each other. Whenever I first found it, I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to read everything on this site. This is so exciting. I'm going to read everything on it. Well, it's been 20 years and I still haven't, because they're constantly, that's a goal I don't think I'll ever be able to reach, because they're constantly adding new poems and poets to it. But it's a fascinating resource, and since I originally started reading on it, they have moved the whole website over to a new URL and everything. They have a yearly festival. And it's this great place, poetryinternational.com. I will put in the description box where I found this poem, and hopefully the link to the poem itself, if I remember. But there will always be some indication somehow in the description box, even if it's just the name of the website where I found it. There will always be some indication of source in the description box, okay? So let me settle down, please. So anyway, this is called Same Old Stories. I'm going to try to get this read because there's something outside got her attention. I have bird feeders out there, and if there's a bunch of stray cats too, and I think the neighbors own some cats and they let them outside, so she likes to protect the bird feeder from the CATs. And that might be what's going on, so if I don't get this read soon, you won't be able to hear a thing. Anyway, Same Old Stories. Grandma and Grandpa live in the next door room. Before bedtime, I crawl into their bed and intently listen. The story always gets caught on the undergrowth, struggling like chestnut harvesters through the muddy forest paths beaten by the tracks of wild game. Once again, Grandma speaks of when drunk Grandpa took the horses to town and returned without them. Of her brother who died during a long-forgotten war. Of a house whose wood evolved into bricks. Excuse me. It's already getting dark, and the stories close along with eyelids, depriving the words of visual effects. The scent of freshly cut grass rushes in through the duvet, the mooing of thirsty cows out of the pillow. A fictitious dog is barking outside the window as Grandpa is coming by foot without the horse. Well, then if she acts up, then we have sound effects, don't we? My dog acts up. I liked that because that's one of the core memories I have of, not so much my grandmother, she wasn't so much a storyteller at all, but my grandfather was the storyteller. And so that reminded me of him a lot. He didn't sleep much because after he was discharged from the Army, because he was a career man in the Army, and then he got like an injury and was discharged from the Army, and then he got a civilian job, you know. He went through several, but by the time I was around, he was a security guard. He would do the security guard thing at the mines, at the coal mines around here. Because if you don't know already, if this is your first encounter with this channel, I'm from Appalachia, Kentucky. So he would, and back then there were a lot more coal mines than there are now, because in the last 10 years, the coal mines have been pulling out. So it's not so much as big a thing as it used to be. Appalachia is finding other ways to try to support its economies now, which is kind of good, because for, I don't know, 150 years there, it was so mono economy with the coal mines. Left quite a bit of a hole there, though, that people are still struggling with, but it'll be okay. The people made it before, they'll make it after, you know. There was life and culture before the coal mines. There will be life and culture after. It's just a matter of figuring it out, and I think that's beginning to happen. anyway, so he was like a security guard for the coal mines. And so he was used to having to be awake at night. So when I would stay with him overnight, he'd be awake all night, sitting there watching TV and stuff. And me being teenagers and stuff, you know, you don't sleep at night when you're a teenager. It's just not something you want to do, even though you should, because when you're a teenager, you need more sleep than at any other time in your life. Human beings do, but it's just not something you're interested in doing. So I would sit up with him, and he would tell me stories, and that continued to be his thing up until he died. Well, he died in 2017. He died after my grandmommy, actually, because she was never in good health. And it wasn't, even though she was never in good health, it wasn't until her later years when they finally diagnosed what her issues were. Even though she had chronic bad health her entire life, it wasn't until she was an older woman before they finally diagnosed it. So it went all that time untreated. So yeah, she just needed a really big hug. She had a hard time. And since, you know, oh well, you don't want to hear all that. But anyway, this reminded me of that, brought up all those nostalgic memories, and so it made me want to read it. And that's really how poetry works. It's as much about the reader as it is the person who wrote it. Because this is what I've discovered being a poet myself. You can write something down and you have a whole meaning for it, right? You can make it as abstract or even as concrete as you want when you write it. But when the reader encounters it, they're going to encounter it with their own memories, their own emotional constructs, and all of that. And so the poem becomes something else. You know, that they don't know where you're coming from, they just know the words on the page. And they're coming at it from a whole other place. So the act of creation with any kind of writing, but especially with a poem more so, it happens with any kind of writing, but a poem is so short and abstract by nature that it leaves more room open for this. It really is a two-way. The act of creation with writing is really a two-way street. What the writer does themselves, as I guess you could call them the source of the material, although sometimes we're not quite sure, because sometimes I can go back and read some of my work and be like, how did that come out of me? I'm not even sure if I was totally conscious when I did that. And look, I don't take drugs except what the doctor prescribes, so, I mean, I'm not saying that I was out of my mind when I did it. I'm just saying that you go back and you read this stuff and you're like, what? You know, I mean, at the time when you're writing it down, it makes total sense to you, but give it 2 or 3, 4, or 5 years and go back and read it and you're like, how did I even conceptualize that? It's a thing, and all writers experience it, okay? But that's why I'm kind of like, that whole thing about the writer being the source of the material, it's kind of like, I don't know. I'm not saying that there's like some other entity or anything. I'm not. Because there's not. Okay, I'm not one of those people. But it's also kind of like, I think our subconscious does the writing more than our conscious does. I'll put it that way. But you have that part of it, okay? And then when the writer comes, or the reader comes to it, they're the other half of the creation part, because it's how they read it finishes the creation process, which means there are infinite number of ways to interpret any kind of writing. unless you're a master of description, like, say, J.R.R. Tolkien, because I'm just about everybody you talk to who has read J.R.R. Tolkien's books, like Lord of the Rings and stuff, will come up with almost the exact same picture in their mind. So, I mean, some people get really bored and they're like, there are 5 pages of description just to tell me what this marsh looks like, and marsh, you know, a marsh is a marsh. Ugh, can we just move on? But I'm like, well, that's true, but go ahead and read it because it's effective. Because everybody who's read that will say, well, that's what that marsh looked like, and they will have the same picture in their head. And that's what Gandalf looks like. They will have the same picture in their head. It was effective. But that is very rarely the case with writers, right? And poetry especially leaves a whole lot to the imagination of the reader. Because it's short, it's compact, it relies on imagery, but the imagery is very abstract when you write it. So it's very nebulous, and it's all how the reader is going to come at it with their own background and their own points of reference, you know, their own idea of what a tree looks like, and all of that. And replicate that for as many people that are going to read it. So it's an infinite number of possibilities how that can be interpreted. And they're all correct. They're all correct because the reader is the other half of the equation, right? That's my philosophy of it anyway. Now, your English professor and English teacher in middle school all the way up through academia will say, no, the only correct interpretation is what the author had in mind, what the poet had in mind when they were writing it. When Emily Dickinson speaks of a blue bird, there has to be a symbolic reason why that bird was blue. And I'm sitting there going, well, maybe she just liked the color blue. Maybe the bird was just blue. Didn't have to have some specific reason why the bird was blue. It didn't have to be some symbolic thing, you know, but your teacher will insist on that, right? Because that's what teachers do, right? But when you're actually in actual practice, when you encounter poems in the real world, how it actually works outside of a classroom is the poet's written the poem and they have their idea. Then they publish it. You come across it online or in a magazine. You're reading it. You have your own ideas, your own associations, your own background, your own emotional story that you have lived through, and you're superimposing that on the poem. We all do it. It's called projection. It's a psychological thing. And that becomes part of that poem. So every reader who comes across a poem is going to read it a different way. And that's part of the creation process. That's my theory. But y'all are free to agree or disagree with me, but that's how I see it. Now, it doesn't mean that a poet is going to agree with what every reader who comes across their poem is going to project onto their poem. Because I can tell you right now, there is nothing political about anything I write, but I have had people read my poems and then come up with a complete political analysis, and I'm like, where did you get that? I'm totally against that. Give me my book back. You know. But that's part of that's what they saw in it, I guess, and I have every right to stand up and say, excuse me, no, I don't agree with that, because I don't. But that was their creative process, you know? That's how it works. But anyway, So anyway, my point is, whatever she meant by that, her beautiful nostalgic recollection of her grandparents there, mostly her grandmother, I think. Because her grandfather comes in there with the story about selling the horses while he was drunk. But I think it's her grandmother that's actually telling the story, right? That she's actually in bed with. Yes, once again, Grandma speaks. So she's got this lovely nostalgic story about her grandparents. And then I was reading it and I was like, oh, my granddad. You know, so I'm superimposing my own emotional, nostalgic feelings from my grandparents onto her poem. And that's just how reading poems are. And that's why I wanted to read it. And I hope you enjoyed it too. Please feel free to go back and check out the other poems on this channel. There's so many now. And it's all about sharing the joy of poetry. And if you want to hit the subscribe button so you know next time I upload, it's usually sometime, here lately anyway, usually sometime around the 19th to the 22nd of every month is when I upload the next video. That's been going so well. I may change the schedule here soon and start doing it more often. We will see. As of right now, I think I have enough videos filmed to finish out this year and start 2025. I filmed this one. I don't know when it's going to be uploaded. I filmed this one on July 21st, 2024. So I may change the schedule here soon and start doing it more often. We'll see. But anyway, thank you all for joining me here. I hope you have a beautiful, fantastic, fabulous day. And thank you. Don't honey.